Hello and welcome to another episode of Meenal's World. This week I have my very first guest of the year. It's the lovely Hardeep Matharu from Byline Times, who's a writer and editor of Byline. I met Hardeep a few months ago on Twitter, and I feel like a lot of my guests in the next few months will just be people I met on Twitter during the pandemic. But she, just like everybody else, she's been so supportive and so willing to listen to our story and everything that we're trying to do to protect healthcare workers. Hardeep was born in the UK, and we talk about her upbringing and her identity. And I think it was a really interesting conversation to reflect on who we are and how important it is to take our culture forward. And she talks about the differences between her and her parents in politics. And to have these conversations with our parents, especially during a time like this, has been quite difficult for a lot of us in the South Asian community. Well, not just in the South Asian community in general, I think. We've all been enlightened in some sort of form or another, and we're trying to educate our parents in this way as well. And Hardeep talks about her own personal experience. So I hope you enjoy this episode. And at the end of the podcast, Hardeep does mention how you can get in touch with her, because I'm sure a lot of you would want to get in touch with her. And I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the show, Hardeep. Thank you for joining me today. We've been in touch for a long, long time, it seems, but we've only met once. And even then I had the baby with me. So I feel like I still feel like I need to just sit down with you again and speak to you about who you are and what you do. Because, you know, when I first saw your name on Byline, it was quite comforting to know that someone who is also from South Asian background is also doing work that I feel quite passionate about as well. There was a kind of comforting feeling when I saw your name on Byline. So thank you for joining me. I know how busy you must be. Seems like there's a story breaking every 10 minutes these days.
No, thank you for having me. It's been a busier time than we expected, actually. Usually the run up to Christmas is a bit calmer, but not this year. But no, it's a real pleasure, Meenal. And you know, I admire so much what you've been doing in the past year. So it's great to speak to you as well.
Thank you, Hardeep. I know a lot about the work you do and the things that you feel passionate about, but I always feel that all of this has to come from somewhere, which is why I want to go back to your upbringing, Hardeep. Where were you born? Was it in the UK?
Yes, so I was born in London, and my father grew up in Nairobi in Kenya, British Kenya as it was then. My mother grew up in post-partition India, and they came to Britain, I'd say they've been here over 40 years now. And me and my brother and my sister, I'm the youngest, we were all born in London. And I grew up in southeast London, where I lived for many years. And yeah, it was quite interesting, because the area I grew up in, or rather the sort of street that I lived in, was also home. It was home to the headquarters of the British National Party. So as a child, I remember sort of after the murder of Stephen Lawrence, which happened in Eltham, which is fairly close by, I remember sort of protests and police on horses and all these things going on outside our living room window. And yeah, it was quite interesting sort of experience in that sense. But yes, so born and bred in Britain, very kind of proud to be British, very proud to be Indian. And I guess I really like exploring in my work the sort of the navigation between these two things, between
because Hardeep, you've been quite vocal about your parents' I would say political points of view on Byline. There's an article that I read which it's just come out today actually. It says today, but it was written on the 13th of December, so not so long ago. And the title is How My Punjabi Immigrant New Labour Supporting Parents Were Charmed by Boris Johnson. Now, I know this is a conversation that we've had before, but firstly, I want to strip it down. You've spoken about Stephen Lawrence. You've spoken about the inequalities that you saw growing up in East London. And I'm sure your parents also faced some form of discrimination when they came to the UK, especially coming from Kenya and from India. So my first question is, what what was it like for your parents raising three Sikh children in Southeast London at the time? Was there a lot of navigation involved in terms of making sure that you were safe and making sure that you were getting the best opportunities possible?
Yeah, it's interesting because so I really want to ask my parents that question, and I think that in
We
itself
should
is
get
very
them on the podcast
interesting.
too. Let's just have a round table.
I'd love to know what they think about that. But one of the things I remember a lot about my childhood was a sense of caution and a sense of, we were always inside. We were inside the house, even in school holidays, we were sort of very much inside. And there was always a sense that you needed to be careful. And that was just in a wide sense, not necessarily just about racism, but a caution and a sense that we do need to be careful about what we're doing and who's around us and what's going on, and one should be aware of that. And so I remember that, and in itself that can be quite limiting, I think. But there was definitely a sense of that. And I think what was emphasized, perhaps unconsciously rather than consciously because it was linked to racial inequality or prejudice and discrimination, was that, like many South Asian parents, my parents believe very strongly that education is your passport, that that is the route by which you can better your own life. And I think because their generation made so many sacrifices, moving across countries and all these things. My mother she has a master's degree in political science from India, and when she came here, obviously that doesn't necessarily translate, so she spent many years just bringing up me and my brother and my sister. Eventually found had a career here after many years later. But yeah, a sense that education is something that you can almost use to transcend some of the stuff you're going to be up against. So I think that was very strong, that one must try to develop a sense of, one, there's information, there's knowledge, and there's wisdom. And also I think, I don't know, it was quite, in a way, I come from quite a philosophical family, I think. I don't think, again, that's unusual for South Asian families. There was a sense of the spiritual, there was a sense of the bigger picture, and that was definitely a factor as well. So very pragmatic on one hand and quite philosophical on the other. But I think it was all unconscious. So your question is, what were the challenges on a practical level? I think the most interesting thing is it was pretty unconscious. So I don't think I really spoke to my parents about race growing up. We were obviously very aware that we were Indian and therefore different, but we didn't talk in terms of these are the challenges and there's this and there's that. The other extraordinary thing that I found when I interviewed my father last year for an article I wrote about my parents voting to leave the EU, I was talking to my dad about sort of this sense of allegiance he feels to Britain. He feels very British, it's the mother country, and also the British Empire did some very questionable things in India and Kenya, and therefore there was a feeling that Britain owes an allegiance to immigrants like my parents rather than people coming from Europe. But one of the things he said when I said, well, what about the racism you must have faced when you came to Britain? What about that? That scapegoating. And he said, well, yeah, but that wasn't new. I faced that in Kenya, because again, the British were in Kenya during the empire and had created a stratification of society. So Indians were middle class in Kenya. And so, but there was still a distinction between sort of the white ruling class, Kenyans and Indians. And he said, well, I faced that discrimination in Kenya. I faced it when I came to Britain. It's just something you get on with. And that again, that unconscious normalization of the expectation of prejudice, discrimination, and inequality, I think that's almost what's most stark to me.
I agree, Hardeep. I feel like my parents also succumbed to the higher power, in quotation marks, a higher power. Like, we just have to accept that this is our reality. I mean, even when I went out to protest, my parents were like, who the hell do you think you are? going against such a big establishment. And I said, but why not? You know, it's it doesn't matter what the color of my skin, doesn't matter where I'm from. The fact is that this is the truth and I have to stand up for it. I mean, for me, my skin color or my background didn't matter at all. I also feel that our parents, I wouldn't say our parents, but generally there are some people in that generation who feel that when they came to the UK, when they came to Europe, they feel that that was right because they came in an acceptable way. It's like they didn't come in an illegal way, or they didn't do anything dodgy to get into the country. So, you know, they were allowed to come in, it's fine. And then we talk about ending free movement in the UK, and you you ask them and you say, well, there are the people who probably are in the same position as you who might not be able to make it. And their answer is always, yeah, but they might be coming in a dodgy way. They probably want to come and earn money, and they want to sell drugs. And there's a different narrative completely that's been put in their head by the media and by, well, our society. Is that the kind of narrative you're seeing with your parents as well?
I think that you're absolutely right to bring up that narrative, which is pervasive, I would say, in British culture, not just politically, you know. And I again, I've written about this, and I bring it back to as I call it, the old colonial divide and rule, you know, which is, you can see it. It's going on. It is promoted by the current leadership. This notion of creating otherness, creating difference. The most prominent manifestation of that, I guess, is Brexit. You know, instead of people coming together and collectively thinking what's best for them, you start dividing them, you start making them go against each other. So I think that definitely, the divide and rule aspect, which I think we're going to see a lot more of in the coming year, especially as these sort of culture war debates continue to be weaponized by Boris Johnson's government. So I think that is very prominent. And there is a sense, isn't there, as I think maybe it's in a way it's just a very human thing as well, that as you get older, like as that generation gets older, they feel a certain, it is two things. They feel a certain sense of security and also a sense of insecurity, I guess, which is why these sorts of narratives around other people are coming here and doing things more easily and taking the easy route when you had to work really hard, and other people getting away with it, I think has some resonance. I do think people like my parents, people of that generation, did see coming to Britain as a very big thing. You know, they were from countries of the empire. They you know, saw its values as something to aspire to. And we're talking about many different aspects, and I think they do feel British, and I think they do feel that they have made a contribution to the country in a way that is very tangible and deserves some recognition. And I also think that it's a very human frailty to too easily forget the prejudices and the difficulties one faced oneself. And I think it's a very human instinct to think that as long as you feel better and secure, it kind of blinds you to seeing how other people can be destabilized and how that's not good as a whole for everyone. So the sadness about the Brexit project, for example, is that it was a cloak, wasn't it, for a big project of xenophobia and and considering what sort of country is Britain, you know, what kind of people do we want here? That was really kind of the driving force behind it all. And so, you know, ending free movement and taking umbrage with European migrants is not going to advance the cause of people of colour living in this country, etc. But I do think it's hard to, that nuance, and it's hard to get to, I think, if that makes sense.
You made a very good point about the divide and rule, because it's not just divide and rule between those who are British, those who are Asian. It's divide and rule within communities within communities. You look at the Asian population, and you can see the divide and rule within the Asian communities, and it's incredible to see what it's taken for them to achieve that, right? And I personally feel it all boils down to the consumption of media. I'm very careful with what my parents read, and I try to educate them all the time. Like, my dad buys Daily Mail newspaper, and I'm like, oh,
No, I
do you think you should
know.
be buying that? And do you feel that a lot of their responses and a lot of the actions that they take has been a result of the media that they consume?
I think it's a number of factors. I think that may be one of them. I think the BBC as a national broadcaster ran into some real difficulties around things like Brexit. I'm not sure it gave, the kind of balanced, not balanced, that's not the right word. I think it fell short in terms of actually looking at the benefits of European Union, looking at what people's problems actually were with it, and looking at the campaign around it, and how that was run. So I do think that misled many, many people. So I think the national broadcaster, which my parents watch, BBC, a lot of families watch it, fell short. I mean, I think it's a combination of the media. But I think it's also unconscious belief systems. And I think this is the thing I do think is so important, because it's the hardest to tackle. And we all do it. We all walk around with unconscious sort of ways of being, which we barely recognize ourselves. These really deep ways of how we feel about things and what we believe. And I think that's what I find when I talk to people as well about British society and about issues of race and identity and class. People of colour will say to me that the thing about the British system is that it's so insidious. It's under the surface. It's very hard to pinpoint exactly, the divide and rule or the class stratification or all of this stuff. It's hard, and I think that is very British. And I think my parents are very British in that. I don't think they walk around every day, thinking, oh, we grew up under the empire or in or former colonies, and this is how it's in kind of influenced our thinking. I don't think they think that. I just think it's the water we all swim in. I think Britain's history, colonial history and its imperial past, is the water we all swim in, and people like us might be a bit more aware of that or up for exploring that because of our backgrounds. But there'll be most people living in this country, even if they were born here, it is still the water they swim in. And the water we swim in is made up of the politics that we have and the culture we have and the media we have. So it is part of it, but I think it's a wider thing about the unconscious forces that shape us. And there is no easy way, I think, to immediately tackle that.
Well, I remember when I was in Czech Republic, studying medicine was 6 years. So it almost felt like I had to relearn everything, because when I left home, it gave me a chance to step out of that massive this bubble that I was in, and I felt like I had a bit more access to learning and trying to create my own ideas. But that meant that when I went back home and spoke to my parents about certain topics, there was a lot of clashing involved, and it was difficult to get through to them. And don't get me wrong, I still haven't mastered that art just yet, but I feel like I'm getting better at it. And a lot of it does involve some sort of empathy and understanding where they're from. Now, from my side, it feels like a lot of the times when I speak to my dad, especially about certain things, he's always with the idea of, well, Mina, look, you're comfortable, you're a doctor, you're earning money, it's fine, you're happy, just get on with it. Why are you trying to talk about Brexit and all these things? That's got nothing to do with you. You're still going to have your job, it's fine. But my retaliation is, I'm fine, but everybody else is going to struggle. And I feel like our parents were living in a generation where they just had to get to the end. They just had to earn their money, bring it home, and that's it. We are a bit more privileged in the sense that we have the capacity to think a bit more outside the box and how we can play a more positive role in society. When did this idea sort of start coming into you? Because obviously, I mean, from what I've read, it seems like there will be topics that clash with your parents' line of thinking. How do these conversations go, and how do you try and sort of tame it down a bit so you can sort of meet in the middle?
So I think I'm always sort of fascinated by the nuance of things and the grey areas. So I think these kind of conflicts are always opportunities for learning, first and foremost. But they can be difficult, and I agree with you that, in a way, all of our parents and their generation sacrifices and their sort of just get your head down and get through it ethic has given us the privilege of being able to, be educated and to be free thinking and think about how we might want to have, help change society and all of this stuff. I think understanding and empathy is the key, actually, because especially because their experiences have been quite difficult and have entailed in themselves a lot of learning. Brexit was the obvious one where I just, me and my parents were not on the same page there. So I voted to remain, they voted to leave, and the whole run up to the campaign, all three of us, like me and my siblings, we knew that they were thinking about, we knew they were going to do it. We knew it, and we talked to them, and they were like, no, this is what we think, and we've got our right to vote, so this is what we're going to do. And I mean, it happened, and then it was only last year that I was talking to my colleagues at Byline Times. Well, actually, what was really interesting was I was invited with two other female journalists to a talk in this very grand sort of building near Whitehall, very, very imperial looking. And we were going to be asked about journalism, and it was like a very small audience of about 100 people, mainly sort of, I would say, white, middle-class male audience. And one of the questions that was asked of me was, what do you think is one of the problems with news? And I said, well, in the 24-hour/7 news cycle, I think we've lost all context. We're not really looking at the structural issues as to why things are happening and how it ties in. And I said, so for example, we're always talking about Brexit. How often do we talk about empire? And there was complete silence, I will always remember that moment. There was just complete silence. The person who asked me the question just looked at me. It wasn't necessarily in a negative sense. It was just silence, it was just so telling. The silence was so telling. And so afterwards, I was having this conversation with my colleagues from Byline Times who were in the audience. And I said, that's just crazy. Like, empire is just like a normal thing to talk about or to be aware of. And they were like, not in this country. And I said, well, my parents voted to leave. And I obviously know it's to do with unconscious ideas that go back to the colonial mindset. And they were like, I don't think everyone does know that. You should write about it. And so I went to my parents and I said, I'm going to write this article about why you two voted to leave the EU. And they were sort of like, oh, okay. But it was sort of, the approach was to understand rather than blame them or say, or raise questions about why they would have done this. It's like, well, we have to understand why. And, it was a really interesting conversation. My father loved growing up under British rule insofar as it gave him access to a culture that he otherwise never would have had. And I think it did contribute. I grew up in a house with lots of books around and newspapers, albeit tabloids. But still, the news was always on. And he was really proud of that. He was proud that he, sitting in Nairobi as a child, could read Time magazine and listen to Radio 4. That was a big thing. And the British and their values around education and how to present oneself, that was a big thing. And so I think it is always about understanding. And the reaction, for example, to that article was, wow, this is really thought-provoking. We'd never thought about this before. It wasn't like, why did they do that? How could people like this be so reckless? Or why, it was like, oh, that's really interesting. We just never thought that these dynamics were in play. Another kind of way in which it comes up, I guess, is I'll often be on the phone to my mother, whose family lives in India, in Delhi. And my mom would say to me, oh, what's going on with Modi now in India? It's really, really concerning. And I'm like, yeah, it is really concerning. But Modi in India is also Trump in America and is also kind of Johnson in Britain. Obviously, they have their differences. They're not the same people, but it's the same sort of thing. So if you're upset about Modi in India, also that's not too dissimilar to Johnson in Britain. I'm trying to make that comparison. And it's interesting. I'm not saying my mother, by the way, supports Johnson's approach to things, but it's just interesting that it's harder for me to get that comparison across, because to her, Modi in India is really quite horrific. And Britain is a country which has democracy and the rule of law and it's not as corrupt as India. And therefore,
Well, that's the thing,
it's hard
Hardeep.
for me to say Johnson, Modi. Well, she's like, well, thank God we live in Britain.
Yeah.
It's that kind of, and that's another way in which it comes up. But I can understand where it comes from. Why would those two things be comparable if your starting point is India has these problems?
And that's a really good point, Hardeep. And this is something that Nishant always says, is that the difference is that the corruption happens here, as it does in other countries like India, in certain parts of Africa. The difference is that people here speak really good English and wear nice suits. And I think that's what the difference is. And that's what our parents see. They see this white man in a nice suit who speaks excellent English, and he went to Eton, and they just fall at his feet and they're like, yeah, whatever he says. I know this might be a very difficult question for you to answer, Hardeep, but in a nutshell, can you explain, and I want to know as well, why did your parents vote leave?
Because I think what it came down to is they felt that Britain is a country that fundamentally should stand on its own and it should control who comes into this country. And I think that they feel that I don't think they felt much connection to Europe. So it's not the continent is not something they ever explored. I don't think they feel much connection to Europe, let alone the European Union. And I think that having gone through the experience of being migrants to this country and having spent a long time, working hard, paying their taxes, and really in a way, subscribing to the British way and aspiring to that for their children and being proud of that identity. I just think that they felt unconsciously they wanted recognition for that. They felt that we don't necessarily need European migrants coming into the country. And I do think that to some extent, it was these warped narratives that you find in the media that people are coming here and getting away with things that obviously my parents' generation didn't get away with. They didn't even try it, and I think there was that. I think it is that, yeah.
So Hardeep, we've spoken a lot about politics, more than I expected. But I know that we can go on for forever, but I want to know a little bit more about your upbringing. I mean, in Southeast London, and your mom from India and your dad from Kenya, how important was it at home to stick to your culture and your roots and stuff? Because when we were growing up, praying was important, going to the mandir, to the gurdwara was important. And in fact, I think my mother went to the other extreme where she sort of over-educated us on everything with the fear that we would become too westernized. So I would go back to India and I would pray in the morning and my cousins would be like, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this? So what was it like for you and your siblings?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because it's something I'm always exploring. And I always think I don't think in my adult life there's ever been a day where I've woken up and not thought about these questions of identity. Identity is a big word now, it's everywhere. But, these questions of, where does one fit, belonging, how one sees oneself, community, individualism, the collective, where does freedom lie, all these questions, they're always, I find, very interesting. And I think that's partly because, as you say, I had immigrant parents from different, colonial countries who came here to Southeast London, where you have this undercurrent of sort of racism, I would say, on our doorstep, literally. I think then it was always also quite interesting because I look very white, so I don't look like a lot of my family physically. I had very kind of strawberry red hair when I was little. Now I have kind of deep auburn reddy hair. I have very fair skin, I have freckles. And I don't really, my parents, I would say they're quite fair for Indian people, but I don't necessarily look like them. My siblings also they're quite fair, but they have black hair and things. So I do physically look very different from my parents and my family and maybe the Asian community. So in my particular case, this exploration of, what was it like growing up, and identity, and where does one fit? It's always been very interesting, because I would say that people have always thought I was just a white girl sort of thing. Growing up, I was considered a white girl, and I would say in my own family, I was considered a white, not my direct family, but the wider community, I was also considered like a white girl. And then sort of I studied law at Cambridge University and on all this sort of thing, and became educated in the way my parents always wanted for me, in which I wanted for me. And I think in sort of a wider community's eyes, I became more and more sort of English or British. And because I don't look necessarily Indian, it was interesting, because you can kind of dance in those circles in sort of British society, because you're not considered obviously other, but obviously I know that I am. So there's an interesting dichotomy where I feel other in both communities. I feel other in my own community. I think partly that is because of how I look, and I think partly it's just how I've been brought up. My parents are quite, liberal, free-thinking people. They very much believe they brought their kids up in Britain, and therefore we must move with the times, as they always say. They're aware they didn't bring us up in those countries, and therefore those traditions are not going to necessarily be relevant or a big thing in our daily lives. So I felt other in that community, and I felt, and I'm still other in sort of British society, which some people might listen to me and hear me and find that hard to believe. But, my name is very, Hardeep Matharu. I'm still, I am Indian, and my parents didn't have any contacts in journalism. They didn't know, they didn't go to university in this country. They're not, educated in that sense. So I don't have any contacts. I have no concept of networking, British society, none of this stuff. So I very much feel other, and I am of colour, and I come from that community. But it's been a very interesting sort of dance between them both. And I think it's interesting, because what I love about coming from an Asian culture is this sense of belonging that you feel. You must know it from your own experience. You go to a big family wedding, or just get-togethers, and there is such a sense of community, and that is so nice. That there's so many people that are there and willing to be on hand to help in some way. But I've always seen the shortcomings of a form of tribalism, which I think is limiting. And that didn't ever come from my parents. I just always have been aware of it. I can see more widely what that sense of tribalism does to people. It limits them. And there's a big keeping up appearances culture in Asian society. What's that person doing? What school did they go to? Who's she married to? And I just never really want it. I just don't like any of that. I find it limiting. But what was so British society and growing up in London and all this stuff has been fantastic, because it is very free, but it also has its own tribalism, which is called the English class system. So you don't really, so I don't know if that answers your question, but it's something I think about a lot, like it's very interesting, where does one belong? And yeah. I think the answer is we're all full of plurality and multiplicity, and that's what we must embrace, that you can be Indian, you can be a certain Indian on your own terms, rather than the terms of whichever wider community you come from. And you can be British on your own terms. You can call out the class system, having gone to Cambridge, I think, because there are structural issues there, which me going to Cambridge doesn't get rid of. Just like Priti Patel being Home Secretary doesn't mean we live in a non-racist Britain. It just doesn't, it's not the case.
Well, that's the thing, Hardeep. A lot of people ask me, where are you from? I was born in Gibraltar. I studied medicine in Prague. I'm living here in the UK. My family are originally from Delhi. When they ask me, where are you from? I'm like, well, I don't really know how to answer that question. And it all boils down to the fact that we have to ask ourselves, right? Like, why does identity matter so much to us? Why does it matter that we have to label ourselves with a certain culture? I feel very proud to be South Asian, but also at the same time, I feel very proud to be living in British society as well. And I don't really know where that leaves me. So I think that the conversation needs to change with regards to who we are and where we're from, and maybe just be and just enjoy who we are and what we're doing, because this whole idea of labeling, as you said, it does to some extent lead us towards tribalism. And you spoke about going to Cambridge, Hardeep, and this is something I did want to ask you. I mean, as a Sikh woman studying law in Cambridge, what was that like for you? Did you face any prejudice? Did you face any like situations where you felt that maybe you didn't get to a certain point because of who you were?
So it's interesting. My experience of Cambridge University was that it was very diverse from my point of view. So there were lots of people there from diverse communities. I would say I learned lessons about class rather than racial distinction at Cambridge. So there was definitely a class thing going on. But no, I mean, Cambridge was interesting in that, I don't know, I felt it was actually really enjoyable. I think I was lucky because I found a group of friends that I really liked. They all studied medicine. Actually, they're all Asian in some form. And so we had a great time. We worked hard. We played hard.
You seem to attract doctors quite a lot.
Yeah. So it was that experience itself was actually really exciting because a lot of us who became friends had come from these quite sheltered Asian families, and so we were just like, wow, you know, we get to meet each other, and we didn't take for granted what an experience it was. I think studying law was a challenge. It was a challenging subject, but it was very rigorous. It was all really good. I think what was interesting for me was actually after I left university, because I think I didn't know when I was at university that I would go into journalism or do any of that. So I finished my law degree and then just went back home to my parents, and everyone was like, oh, you're going to go into law? And I was like, no. And that was difficult for my family to understand at first, because again, everything we've discussed about education being the passport, you know, you've done the degree, why are you not going to now do anything with it? And I like studying law, but it was more, what I always found really interesting was that law is there, and it's these black and white pillars that we structure society by. But fundamentally, it governs human behavior, which is completely grey. And so our adversarial system, especially, for example, in criminal law, is that sort of black-white. And I love the grey, and I thought, I'm interested in society in a more general sense. I want to explore it in a wider sense. And I left university, I graduated from university, and again, journalism had never been presented to me growing up. There were always newspapers around, the news was always on. Something seeped in, I think, absolutely. But that was not a path that my parents would have suggested, because you should do something that's much more stable and not too risky. Journalism is an unknown quantity. But that's why it was interesting when I left after university and I was getting into journalism. I went to journalism school, etc. But again, you know, there was no source of, my parents didn't know anything about journalism. They were like, how are you going to do that? And, you know, so I think that's where it's not discrimination, but it's sort of, again, it's the water we swim in. You know, the water I was swimming in at home, and how I grew up. It wasn't like do journalism and read this and sort of think about these ideas and how you might write about them. I was very much on a path to study law and become a barrister, and then I got, you know, I was like, well, that's not what I'm really interested in. I like the grey. I want to explore, want to keep learning, keep being open. And I think, yeah, I mean, it has been, I'm very fortunate now, and I've had some great experience in journalism, and it is a notoriously difficult industry to get into. But I would say it was difficult, mainly because I had no idea how to navigate it, and I didn't have anyone around me who could help me. And I'd studied law at university, so I didn't meet anyone at university who was doing that. So I was I did feel very stuck for a while. It was very mentally kind of, how on earth do I navigate this? And then obviously my parents didn't quite understand what was going on. And so you have that added level of, oh, I'm going against something, and you know.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting you say that, Hardeep, because there was something I read about a few days ago. It was Purna Bell, who's also a South Asian lady, who's also a journalist, and she was talking about how she got into the industry, and she did mention that for one of her commissions, she had to chase up the same person by sending like around 40 emails just to get through. And there's a lot of perseverance involved to trying to get your article out, or trying to get your voice to be heard. I mean, now you're the editor of Bylines and you're working with Peter, which is incredible. And I think that the work that you're doing is so important, because the work that you're doing, Hardeep, is not so much about presenting us the information, it's more about making us think.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we need in our society, because information is around everywhere. We can get it from anything. You just have to click your finger, type something on the laptop, and you'll get the information. But the true change comes when we make people think in our society. And I think that's something that I wasn't raised with. In my house, we were just told, this is it, get on with it. You're going to be a doctor, get on with it. Even in medical school, you know, everything is a science, what it is. This is the anatomy, this is it, this is the answer, move on. So even in medical school, I feel like that part of my brain was never challenged, until obviously this year, when I started to see the realities of the system and the society that we live in. I started to question a lot of things. How important do you think your work today is for our generation? Because our generation is filled with so many people who now especially want to be the next leaders. They want to be the next prime minister. They want to go out there and make that noise and make that change. Do you feel a certain responsibility in our society? And I would generalize that, not just with South Asian girls or South Asian community, but generally with the British public. Do you feel that you need to always have that switched on?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for picking up on that, is what you feel the work that we do is characterized by, because it's absolutely the mission, as well as truth, justice, and making people think more, contributing to people understanding more. And it was always why I got into journalism, actually. I remember early on when I was a local newspaper reporter, and a colleague said to me, why did you get into journalism? I said, because I want to make people think. And it really was. And then I did local news for many years. I reported on potholes and the local hospital, and planning meetings and all this stuff, which is very important and is not happening now with the decimation of local news. But yes, I always wanted to get to a stage where I could have a role in journalism and public discourse in whichever way, which is about making people think more. I think is desperately needed. I think that's what I was getting at when I was saying that in the sort of media landscape we're in now, we have lost context. And what I mean by that is we have lost the ability to piece things together and understand more widely why things are going on. We've talked before about how obviously this year a lot of shortcomings with, the NHS is on its knees, but that's not something that's new. You said that you have been talking about this before the coronavirus crisis. It's a structural issue, and we need to understand what is going on there. Is it political? Is it cultural? What's happening? And I think when we started Byline Times, which, as you know, doesn't follow a news cycle, but covers what the papers don't say. So stories which are underreported, or angles which a new lens to look at things through. It was very much, we felt that, there wasn't, God, what was I saying? Sorry, I just lost my trail of thought. Your question was, sorry, I just lost my trail of thought.
It's okay.
It was, very much, yeah. It was...
My question was, Hardeep, just to help you out, my question was, how important do you feel? Like, do you feel like a burden, or do you feel, not a burden, but how important do you feel your role is in society to actually create that change that we're all looking for and that we all need, really?
Yeah, so when we started Byline Times, which doesn't cover the news cycle, but what the papers don't say, so underreported stories or a new way of looking at existing issues, it was because it was part of this very important issue that the sort of crisis we have in our democracy and the crisis I think we have in mainstream journalism in this country, these are not in silos. They're not disconnected from each other. They feed into one another. And I think that what we try to do on Byline Times, and we do feel a responsibility, is not a burden, it is actually a privilege and a responsibility, is to try to inform people, but as you say, to make them think more deeply. And I think that is the only way you kind of step towards having an informed citizenry in a democracy. And I think that is what we have lost, that journalism is it is a pillar of democracy. It was always, in a functioning, healthy democracy, it should always be seen that way. And it's not just about holding people to account and revealing things that people in power don't want you to reveal. I also think it's about creating people who can think critically and actually be more free thinking as well. And that is what we did not feel was happening in the media, in the mainstream media at least, in some prominent parts of it, and that it's been captured for other interests, to be quite frank, in terms of who it's owned by, etc. So yeah, that is really important for us. But what we're also not saying actually on Byline Times is that, we are so far above everyone else and we know better and we're the great and good. I think we're all in this together. Like we like engaging with our readership. The newspaper should be something that speaks to its readership. It's a paper for everyone. Because I think fundamentally change does only, it's two different things, isn't it? I think change comes when individuals recognize that something has to change, and it's first within, and then they're kind of motivated to do something about it. And then I think it's those motivated individuals coming together in a collective. And we really call it, Byline Times has a mission, and we call it like a fellowship, and that really, and I think both of those things are relevant. It's the meta and it's the individual, people need to be made to think and consider nuance and complexity and think about their own lives. And that includes our own shortcomings and our own frailties and all this stuff. And then it's about how do we sort of get to that next level where we really push on and we can really change things. It's always at the forefront of our mind. We don't, at the moment, I think we're seen as a niche kind of specialist media outfit. But, we are very ambitious for what we want to do with it. It's our ambition to have that wider impact. But like so many people out there, organizations out there, we're just kind of racking our brains as to how best we can do that. But I think making people think is not a bad starting point.
Yeah, and the thing is, Hardeep, I feel like we're living in a generation where information is available left, right, and center. And it almost feels like sometimes what we say can be just drowned in all the noise that's out there, online especially. When I first started to get into podcasting and interviewing people and reading up on topics that I wasn't comfortable reading and trying to learn especially, I started to obviously understand the idea of the left and right and how you have channels like Fox News and Alex Jones. And a part of me thought, well, how is it even allowed on TV, right? Like the kind of misinformation that's being spread. You think, well, why is it allowed? Why is there no legal boundary to it? And if we sort of eradicate that completely, will our society improve? But then at the same time, I also feel that you have to go back to what we were saying, that people have their own opinions, and there has to be some sort of compassion and empathy there as well, that people will think the other way. So maybe that is also needed, so we have a better sort of view of what's happening around us in the world. Now, as a journalist, Hardeep, I want to ask you what you feel about these certain news outlets who are completely on the extreme side, the complete opposite side of what you're doing. Do you think it's still important to have that? Do you think that our society sort of needs both sides, or do the extreme sides need to just sort of disappear now?
I think the tragedy of what's happened in recent years is that we've had a breakdown in truth. Not only in that people increasingly feel like they can't trust what is being told to them by people in positions of power, but truth itself has become contested. Facts have become things to be debated, alternative facts, as was famously said by someone in Donald Trump's administration earlier on in his time in the White House. So I think that is the central problem. Because if you've got people who are just saying that something is not factually true and debating the validity of things that in commonality we should agree on, because we know that that is the case. I think a lot of the problems are stemming from that. And then on top of that, we've got a lot of commentary, and we've got social media, which has been fantastic in many ways, but it is a platform for everyone to have their opinion, you know, and for it to gain a lot of attention quite quickly, sometimes in ways that are unexpected. So I think we have had an amplification of what people feel and what people think. And because of social media, we're all encouraged to have sort of an image and a brand, and we need to know what we think about things quickly and in a black and white way. I think those outlets that spread active disinformation, i.e. things that are just not true, narratives that are damaging to our social cohesion that are just not true, I don't think that is defensible. And something we report on is the lack of accountability in the British press is not really there in terms of regulation. People are allowed to get away with a lot with no real recompense. So there's an impunity, I think, and there's a dominance, I would say, of some of those outlets. I don't think it's defensible. I think if we could agree on facts again, and the fact that they're important, and some objective truth, I think then, of course, people are going to have their own takes on things. But I think it has been skewed. I think there's a lot of people's opinions and views flying around, and and that is different from news. There is a difference, and I think the two things have just been conflated. And I do think, I don't know how helpful it is really to go out onto the street and ask 3 random people what they think about Brexit, and then 3 people who have a different opinion, and they could all be saying things which are informed by things that are not factually correct. I don't know how that advances anything really. It's just kind of false balance. So that's a big problem as well. But I think there's also a wider issue, Meenal, about the desire for investigation. So journalism is at its heart meant to be, it is an investigative process. It's about exploration. It's about lifting the lid. And that has, unfortunately, in British press, that's kind of gone. There doesn't seem to be that same fuel to do that kind of work. There are some great niche outlets doing it, and some aspects of the mainstream media do it. But generally, for a number of reasons, I don't think that's there either. So we're just getting a lot of what people think, and we're all kind of now got platforms to say what we think. And there's no room for nuance. As soon as any nuance is introduced, that's it. We have to go back to a black and white resolution on what has been said. We're not focusing anymore on factual, objective facts and the value of truth. And then we've got other powerful interests in the mix that mean that the platforms that are promoting sort of disinformation or narratives that are deeply unhelpful, they get away with it time and again.
And that's the frustrating part, as you said, the getting away with it part, where there is no limit to how far people can go. And that's the thing, Hardeep. This is, unfortunately, this has to be my last question to you, only because I can hear Radhika screaming downstairs, and I don't know how Nishant is handling it. I'd love to go on, but you're very passionate about everything that you do, Hardeep, and I can see it in your writing, I can see when we speak, and I understand what it's like to be so involved in something, not just because you're working working on it as a job, but emotionally there is an investment in what you do, because you want to create a change in society. You want to make sure that people understand what you're trying to do, and there are times where it's difficult to switch off, especially now where we've had the pandemic, we've had Brexit, and I've had lots of sleepless nights, not because of the baby, but because of the news as well. And you have to find that balance, because if you want to be that person going on for the next few years, the next few decades, there has to be some sort of endurance, right? Because you're not even going to completely burn out. How do you find that balance, Hardeep? And do you have any advice for me?
I was going to ask you that, Mino. It's do you know, it's a really important question, actually, isn't it? And I think one of the positive things to come out of what's happened with the coronavirus and lockdowns is I think there has been a normalization of people having conversations about mental health and well-being, and that is really important. And you know, we talk about it, I feel, just with friends much easily now than we ever did before. I think in normal times, i.e. before this year, like I love sort of going out and socializing, taking my mind off things, all of the things that normal people like doing, switching off. And it has been really tough not being able to do that. It's been tough working from home in the middle of a global pandemic, in terms of being a news outlet in the middle of that. It's been all go, really. And it is hard to switch off. It's hard to have that balance. I think going for walks has been really good for me. So I didn't actually go on like that many walks before the pandemic, but actually that's been really, really good. And just, I don't know, little things like journaling, or just reading magazines that are nothing to do with work. And I like going through, I've got like lots of photos that I haven't organized yet that I've taken from various holidays over the years. I don't know, just quiet things that involve a sense of creativity but are just for oneself. And I think something that someone told me recently, it's really poignant and very, you know, very important. We always have to keep just enough of that little fire going within us, just enough, just a flicker. We always have to keep that flicker there, and like you say, we have to ensure that it's there. And I think for that it does require sort of focusing on what is the bigger picture, actually, and just being human and being more aware that the frustrations and the angers and the bits of ourselves that we don't like to interact with too much, they're all there. I think they've come to the fore for many of us during having to be inside for so long just with ourselves. But I am looking for more ways to switch off, and I've been told I should find them. So,
well, that's the thing, Hardeep. You know, it's all about sort of zooming out and trying to be present in the moment as well. I mean, there are times where I have been guilty of it, where my mind has been somewhere else, and I've had Radhika next to me and she's doing something stupid, like she's smiling or she's chewing on something that she shouldn't be chewing on, and it's like, well, I missed that moment, and it happens, and it's so important to be present as well, because if not, this sort of thing can become quite unhealthy, which is completely defeats the purpose, because if we burn out, then it means that there are less of us to create the change we want to see. But Hardeep, thank you so much for your time. I mean, honestly, I really enjoyed this talk, and I feel really energized now as well. I think I need to go on a run now.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for having me. And this has been a way for me to, you know, inject some balance. Even though we talked about, you know, current affairs and things, it's still a form of balance. You're just talking to someone in such a broad way.
Yeah.
Like, thank you for your interest, basically. It's been a pleasure.
If people want to find you, if people want to follow you, what's the best way they can do that?
Yes, so in terms of Byline Times, of which I'm the editor, it's bylinetimes.com. We have a website, a daily news site which is free to access. We also have a monthly print newspaper which people can subscribe to. In terms of myself, Hardeep Matharu, I'm on Twitter at Hardeep_Matharu. If anyone wants to email me, it's hardeep@bylinetimes.com.
Brilliant, Hardeep. Thank you so much, and hopefully we can meet soon again once all this is over.
Thank you so much, Mina. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Hardeep. Thank you, Hardeep, and thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in to another episode of Meenal's World. Next Friday, I'll have another guest, but I also have another episode coming out on Tuesday. So every Tuesday, I have the Tuesday morning podcast where I ramble on about what's happened during the week, and I especially answer your questions as well. I know we're in lockdown in the UK especially, so please feel free to contact me on Instagram or on Twitter at Meenal's World. And if you also want to contact Hardeep, of course, you can find her on Twitter as well. So I hope you're all staying safe. I hope you've had a good start to the new year, and hopefully this will all be over very soon. I'll see you all next week. Take care.